We are recording the meeting for those folks who registered and are not available to attend. So this is the main event. This is the event that you came for, which is the panel discussion. We've got your back. And this is for business leaders, allies, folks like yourselves who want to show up for your trans and non-binary colleagues. And this panel discussion is really important to have right now, just given how difficult 2021 has already been for those of us who are transgender and non-binary. And this conversation largely focuses on those of us who live in the United States. And I wanted to host this event to empower allies, people just like you, with those everyday actions that you can take to communicate that you do indeed have our backs in the context of the workplace. So for just a little bit of background, if this is a newer topic for you, this year has been particularly challenging for those of us who are trans and non-binary, given the tragic spike in fatal violence that largely targets BIPOC and particularly Black trans women, coupled with the surge of anti-trans legislation. So this is legislation that's been introduced in over 30 states, over 130 bills that largely target transgender and non-binary young people. So business leaders like you have this tremendous opportunity to show up for us, for transgender non-binary people, your colleagues, and also colleagues with trans and non-binary family members. And you might be wondering, you might be here today because you're like, I want to be here, but I don't quite understand this connection of what we're talking about between fatal violence, state-sanctioned violence, and business. And so the good news is that we've got an incredible panel. Our panelists are definitely going to make some really powerful connections. And particularly, we're going to connect some of the research that we know, where we know that the future of work is becoming increasingly non-binary. So when we look at Zoomers, some people are like, Zoomers, what is that? Generation Z. Zoomers, Generation Z are expected to transition genders, or their gender at least in their lifetime, at least one time. And that's kind of clunky research that's done, but what it tells us is that younger people see gender as more fluid. And what we need to do today in our businesses is really prepare for that future of work, the future workforce. So we'll be exploring questions on how do we prepare, what can be done today to support the majority of business leaders who still need to build those gender inclusive organizations for their current trans and non-binary employees. And then we'll also be talking about what advantages businesses like yours can gain by having leaders who are trans and non-binary on your teams, right? So our panel is enormously talented. We're going to be able to explore all of those questions, and we're going to save about 10 minutes towards the end, 10 to 15 minutes to answer all of your questions. So again, if you've just arrived, I thank you for being here. We've got a good sense right now, if you look at the poll results of who's here joining us today, which is a really nice turnout to see. And for myself, just to briefly introduce who I am, my name is Rhodes Perry. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a transgender man, and I'm so honored to be moderating today's panel discussion. I'm also a best-selling author, a keynote speaker, and I'm the founder of a company that helps businesses like yours build a greater sense of safety, trust, and belonging at work. And I am joined by some amazing panelists. So I'd love to briefly introduce them, and then we're just going to jump into the questions. So our first panelist, Tati Moten, she uses she, her pronouns. She is a seasoned human resources and DEI professional. She's also a veteran of the US Armed Forces, and she served honorably as a human intelligence officer. She earned her BA in developmental psychology and her MBA from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is a staunch advocate for the transgender community and consults with organizations like the ACLU and Lambda Legal, amongst many other public and private organizations. So Tati is joined by Autumn Wilder. Autumn uses they, them, theirs pronouns and is a collaborative and innovative systems builder driven by a need for continuous improvement and bringing out the best in teams and individuals. They are currently serving as the co-director of Genentech's LGBTQ plus employee resource group, known as G-Pride. And in this role, they are best known for their ability to be an active builder of bridges between concepts, systems, and people. And then our last panelist, Nico Calvo-Rosenstone, uses he, him pronouns, is a senior diversity and inclusion business partner at Twitter. Prior to his current role, he led Airbnb's global trainings and initiatives, which helped deepen the company's advancement of transgender and gender diverse policies. Nico is also the founder of the Inclusion Practice and has served on the faculty of the Transgender Strategy Center. And he also has been published in various journals, including the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Okay, so we have a lot of expertise on this panel today, and we're gonna get started. We're gonna jump into our questions, and this one's an all play. So Tati, I would love to start with you first, and this is really just kind of thinking about in the context of your work, if you could share just a little bit about why workplace gender inclusion commitments can help advance an organization's broader diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And I think this question is particularly important given our country's large-scale racial reckoning over the past year, and how this work in particular complements work underway right now with orienting towards building anti-racist organizations. So some of your thoughts just to get us started.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Rose. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be a part of this panel today. So when I think about a lot of the themes, and just like with the racial unrest that has been racial and social unrest that has occurred in this country, and thinking about how to support trans employees, and one of the things that this helps to by supporting your trans employees and creating kind of opportunities for inclusion within your organizations. The beautiful part is that trans is a part of who I am. It is not the entirety of who I am. When you start to see the other components that make up who I am, you start to see the DEI person, all of those other organizational skills and all of those things. And so when you begin to diversify your team and you're adding people who are of trans experience and have those same qualifications that fit those particular roles, it helps to kind of further those DEI goals for the organization. One, because it allows and empowers people to be and show up as their best selves. We spend most of our time within our workplaces. So if this is a place that I'm not feeling valued, affirmed in who I am and the work that I'm bringing every day to the office place, that is going to be reflective in just like everything that is, encompassing of the company. But when you allow me to show up as who I am and be my best self every day, then that empowers me to kind of think outside of the box, think of those big picture ideas and bring those to people in leadership, because I'm feeling valued in who I am, and not just for being this number who sits in a cubicle, but as the beautiful Black woman of trans experience who brings a wealth of experience, lived experience, and all of these other dynamics to that particular role. And so like I said, when organizations and companies wake up to see the beauty within trans people, is a day that they will kind of turn that key and that says, hey, we have finally made it to this place where we have all of the pieces. And even in that, there will still be some things missed, but then you allow yourself that grace because you're supporting people who really, really want to be there. We truly want to work. And even when you think about like trans individuals in the military, this is something that we have done. Weren't drafted into this kind of roles. We volunteered to do these things. And so when we come to these organizations and companies that are particularly mission-driven organizations, we're there because we want to be there. And I think the onus is on those organizations and companies to help us to continue to affirm who we are, to stay there.
I love it. Thank you so much, Tati. Autumn, would you like to add to some of the thoughts that Tati shared on just kind of looking at gender inclusion commitments and how it helps advance an organization's broader DEI goals? And I think your perspective at Genentech, it will be really valuable to share here.
Yeah, and thank you, Tatiana. I mean, everything you just mentioned was absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you 100%, 150% more. There's not much I can add to that other than just maybe even give some insights into a little bit of how that might look as well, because it is no longer just a nice to have anymore. Have companies that have broader DEI goals, it's not a nice to have. I mean, given the details that you just brought in, Rhodes, and some of the data that you shared with us, it's now becoming a mandate. Thank God, it's finally here. I think that that critical mass has finally come where companies are being expected to not just sort of like put forth pretty words and concepts about what they plan to do, but they're expected to bring real action and show real change and progress and move the needle on some of these things. And I'm really actually grateful to be able to work for a company now that does that and is almost ahead of the game in some ways when it comes to looking specifically at gender inclusion and also racial diversity. I mean, those are two of our biggest employee resource groups at Genentech, is our African Americans in Business group and our LGBTQ plus employee resource group. So, and I would just say, if there are employees that are finding that their company is wanting to make strides in this area, but they just don't have the real practical support systems put in place in order to make real action, I would have talks with your HR department. Start with HR. Start with as high a level executive as you can and start to see if there can be conversations and holding your companies accountable, holding them to task to start throwing money behind these things. And oftentimes that's what it looks like for corporations is where are the resources going? Where's the money going? How are they actually prioritizing some of these things in a real tangible way? And we have a group, a chief diversity office, actually, that was just instated a couple of years ago. And with that came sort of and we've always had employee resource groups. I mean, for, decades, Genentech has had employee resource groups. However, it's the support became really, really clear once this chief diversity office was set in place, because with that came the official funding that is now allowed to support all the employee resource groups as they go ahead. And before, the employee resource groups are just sort of begging and pleading all the different whatever sponsors, executive sponsors they can find for funds to do their work. But now that we have a chief diversity office, the funds are just there. There's no more begging. It's like, yes, we have prioritized this. Yes, this is a goal. Here are the three main strategies that we're pointing to, and just align up to us to make sure that whatever you're doing in terms of initiatives and whatever you're spending aligns to these three key initiatives. And so I think there is that level of tangible support that needs to happen for things to really become a reality. So when you're doing anti-racist work, when you're dealing with making things, driving awareness around transphobia and homophobia, you have to not just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. And I think the way that a company structures itself, to me, is the biggest indicator of how seriously they take that commitment.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for adding that, Autumn. I think just the focus on capacity building and resources that will advance the work is super important. And what you and Tati have shared already about the value of gender inclusion in that broader DEI work, it's important to add it on paper, and also to put people behind advancing that work and the resources to actually do it. And Nico, I want to turn to you because you have such expertise in working at Airbnb and now Twitter. How does the gender inclusion work that you've done, you have traditionally done this work from that broader perspective. How does it, working with other DEI leaders inside fairly large corporations, how does that actually help folks have these aha moments of making those connections of how we're talking about trans folks over here, non-binary folks over here, we're talking about BIPOC folks over here, one and the same, as Tati was saying, we can't separate elements of who we are. So could you share just a little bit more of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely, Rod. Thanks for the question. So I just want to plus one to Autumn. Some of the best advice I got in this work is follow the money. If there's money behind it, it generally means that it is a priority, especially when we're talking about corporate America. And the other thing I want to draw on a lot is what Tatiana mentioned here. I think inclusion works best when we are able to create solutions that work for all intersectional identities. So the best example I have of this is actually the Black Lives Matter movement and the focus they've put on centering the voices and lived experiences of Black trans women. So if we are able to build a world and able to build companies and policies where Black trans women can truly thrive, where we are addressing gender injustice and we're addressing racial injustice and systemic injustice, then we are going to hit the mark in so many more places than if we silo it to be, oh, we want it to be gender inclusive, or we want it to be Latinx focused. And the same approach applies to how we do DEI goals. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we building processes and systems that work for those that are most underrepresented? And if we can do that, and we can tackle that and create systems that work for the most under-resourced communities, we're going to end up creating solutions and improving the lives of so many more people.
Yes, amazing. Yeah, it goes to kind of John Powell's work of targeted universalism, right? We want everyone to belong. We want everyone to feel included. Whatever that universal goal is, you're not going to get there until you center your efforts around those most likely not to feel and experience that broader outcome that you want everyone to have. I really appreciate that. So for folks that might be outside of our communities, I wanted to pivot and share, hear from each of you all a little bit more about kind of how our current climate, living in the United States, being trans, non-binary people, how that feels for us, number one, and in particular in the workplace. So, so Tati, I wanted to start with you, and just kind of recognizing that this year has been really challenging, having witnessed a 100% spike in fatal violence that's largely targeting Black trans women. And this is, we're not even halfway through the year, or I guess we are kind of halfway through the year, but that coupled with what is happening legislatively, happening in state legislatures across the country of anti-trans legislation that is largely targeting young people. So and this is a heavy question, so kind of take it where you feel comfortable. On this personal level, can you share just a little bit more about what this climate feels like for you, and why you might be watching closely what business leaders are saying and doing, or maybe not saying and doing, but maybe what some of your expectations are of businesses in this moment right now?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first and foremost, living, like you said, it's very personal to me.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of duality that I take upon, because having served this country honorably for 8 years, and it's when I see these things happening in legislation, and particularly under the last administration, the attacks that were occurring for the trans community, from a legislative perspective, it puts me in a perspective. It's like I fought for this country for you to hate me. And so the reality of that is that every day that I wake up, and stepping out, of course, I enjoy several privileges, but also in those privileges, I am also humanized, because every day that I step outside of my door, I have to say to myself, it's today that I will not make it home. And that's the reality for me, living as a Black trans woman in Chicago. And when I think about, on a deeper level, the systems that are being created to kind of embolden these things and empower these things, the attacks that occur against not just, Black trans people, but also other trans individuals and non-binary individuals, because they're being empowered by our governmental institutions. And so when I think about companies, and even in my work as a consultant, surrounding some of these organizations and companies and working with their ERGs, it is very vocally heard that it's not what you say in the moment that is most impactful. It is those moments that you don't say anything, for organizations and companies, where they don't take a position on some of these social justice issues, and particularly surrounding trans murders and violence against trans individuals. All across this country, we're seeing the effects of the disproportionate numbers of, disproportionate violence that is being imposed upon Black and brown trans women. And those losses that will never be actualized, those people who could have quite possibly been the discoverers of the cure for cancers and all of these things, their lives are being completely cut off. And it's happening to younger trans individuals. And so when I think about the legislations that are occurring across this country, these are youth. These are people who are saying, hey, I want to be allowed to play sports, but I also want to be allowed to play the sport of, the gender identity that I have assumed or taken on. And so when I think about those things, for myself, I'm thinking back to the kindergartner who I don't want to play sports. Like, I don't want to go to gym. Like, I want to go to the library and those things. And now these children are being, from a legal perspective, forced or, told that you can't do these things. And that adds more trauma to the trauma that we have already experienced to get to this point where I'm even able to verbalize to someone, hey, I'm trans. And so when you get in those get in those places and spaces, it's one of those things like everything that I have fought for or worked towards is being attacked. And these are the very same people and institutions that are supposed to protect us. And so the organization that I currently work for, during my onboarding, my former director had made a comment, and he was talking about how he had talked to a youth speakers bureau. And one of the individuals had stood up and they said, I knew how to protect myself. I just never knew why I was worth protecting. And although that was used in the context of HIV, it is also applicable for us and within the trans community. Most times we're in spaces where we're like, am I worth protecting? Because every time I turn on the news, everything I hear from, politicians and all of these other people are like, no, they're trying to minimize and marginalize and basically erase who we are. And the fact continues to remain that we are always here. We have always been here. We are making contributions to this country, and we are entitled to those same and equal protections as everyone else.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing so much of your experience, Tati, and just how you opened, and the question that you ask yourself is, today the day I will make it home, right? I mean, for folks that are watching and trying to make connections or build empathy, safety, this basic safety of moving throughout your life and having that, take away just kind of being present in the moment, that's the reality, right? And I think, like, when we make connections of the workplace, what is lost? And you gave a great example of the talent that, if we're not preparing our workplaces today, if we're not using whatever influence we have to have positive representation of our communities, we will never know the talent that isn't able to make it through the doors to be considered for some of the jobs that your companies make available. So I really, really thank you for sharing so generously on your own personal experiences. And in Autumn, I wanted to kind of build on this, and recognizing that you're leading up Genentech's LGBTQ ERG Pride. And so I'm curious in if you feel comfortable sharing more of your own experiences, in addition to what are some of the kind of key struggles that employees at Genentech or maybe elsewhere, other ERGs that you collaborate with who are trans and non-binary, are experiencing right now, given the current climate, given the conditions as Tati had shared with us? What's kind of surfacing in what you're seeing?
Thanks, Rhodes, and thanks, Tatiana, for that. I could really feel the power and kind of also the heartbreak in what you mentioned, and some of that resonated. And obviously there are privileges that I enjoy kind of as a white person, living in San Francisco, no less, which is sort of the gay holy land. So I don't carry around a lot of the same fears that I imagine a lot of other people might, in this condition. Or in this kind of day and age. But that said, I do know that there is the emotional impact that everybody is sort of feeling on more of like a social global consciousness level that's sort of permeating every aspect of everybody's experience, day-to-day experience. And that certainly comes up at work all the time. And again, I'm lucky enough to work for an organization that sees that is aware of that, and it takes that very seriously into heart, and again, actually does something to do it. And so I think a lot of what people are looking for and yearning for, especially over the last couple of years, are really just the safe spaces and the allowance to be able to talk about this as part of their day-to-day experience, and not have it something that has to get shoved under the rug, which, as Tatiana was mentioning before, can lead to all sorts of other re-traumatizing patterns and just make a bad situation worse. So there is that level of awareness that I work within. And again, I'm very privileged and very grateful to have that with me, and totally acknowledge that not every company and not every work experience is like that, probably far from it. But I think if that's any takeaway that other companies can do, is to really hear your employees. And I think, as Nico was saying before too, don't hesitate. You have to have a voice. You have to come right out and say something. You do not delay. This is not something you spend weeks on trying to cultivate the right messaging for. It is something you do the day of or the day after. Immediately you release sort of a communication about what's going on, and letting your employees know that might fit within this line, like that you are in a safe space, that you have their back. that they are going to do, and they're going to listen to, and they are going to open up their ears to what it is you might need in order to feel safe or safer where you are. So, and I think that because we spend so much of our life and so much of our days at work specifically, I think that's why it's even more important that companies kind of take on that role, so that people are not isolated or re-traumatized by the silence that oftentimes accompanies a lot of these dramatic, traumatic events that happen in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And the work that you're leading, and the fact that Genentech has prioritized gender inclusion in kind of the broadest sense of that kind of phrase, it says a lot, and it goes to what I would imagine many companies here value, which is innovation. You want that kind of innovation. People need to feel psychologically safe. They need to be able to know that they can ask for help when they need it, or share a mistake when they make it, or offer kind of feedback on how to do something better, knowing that their job won't be in question. And that's not a given for so many folks in our communities. So the work that you're doing is super, super powerful. And I wanted to go, yeah. Does someone want to jump in?
A quick question around just like what that looks like. And typically what our companies have done, we've even had the head of our company lead a conversation. So basically they've sent out a request for people that might be interested in attending sort of a discussion, a safe space environment that's led by the head of the company, where they can vent and talk about like what's going on for them. Some of these conversations can get pretty emotional, but that's the awareness that they have with it, and they know that that's important. But there's so many productive conversations that come out of this, and real action then I think is the key, that then the head of the company takes from these to make sure that they're doing everything they can to really kind of, again, put their actions where their words are. And they did that when the Black Lives Matter, when George Floyd incident came up. They did that when all the anti-trans legislation came out. They've been doing that with all the Asian American attacks that have been happening lately. So it's consistently, and I think consistency is also the key. Do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for adding that proximity, whether it's kind of a leadership team to kind of all staff, including trans non-binary staff, really getting to know who's on the team and learning more, having kind of respectful curiosity of some of the challenges that get in the way of even feeling safe at work, let alone building trust and performing and having that creativity that we all strive for. And I think that leads to my next question for Nico, which is kind of the roles that you've been in. You're liaising with executives all the time. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, like, what are some of those challenges that as you build trust with kind of folks on the C-suite, what are some of those challenges that kind of you may almost anticipate or predict that come up when talking specifically about advancing gender inclusion commitments?
Thanks for the question, Rhodes. So two main challenges rise to the top almost exclusively. And the first two is this first one, as you mentioned, of just not really knowing where to start. And I'll say the second one first before I dive into details. The second one is not knowing the representation of your workforce. So let me go back to my first point here about not knowing where to start. The best thing folks can do is consult experts in the field. I think far too often this becomes kind of a side project assigned to someone who already is doing 3 or 4 jobs, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves, and going back to that, not getting the budget it deserves. So, you want to gather input from your employee resource groups, and that's a great starting place, but ultimately you want to invest and advocate for budgets to bring expert groups and consultants to guide you through your learning journey and all the changes you want to see in your organization. So hire people like Tati or folks with lived experience who understand how to guide inclusion and understand the nuances of what this means on a multi-sectional level, not just for trans issues. Having people with lived experience is going to mean volumes in terms of what you're able to see as impact, as opposed to bringing people in who very might well have the professional experience, but can't add that personal level as well. So that's the first one. So knowing where to start, bring in people, put the budget behind it about how to get the best, smartest people in the room to guide you through this journey. The second point I want to make here, which is very important, is folks don't have representation data of their current workforce. So ultimately, it is very hard to measure and set goals when you don't have a baseline metric. And this oftentimes happens because we aren't tracking this data. When we're asking for ID data, sexual orientation, gender identity does not come up. Oftentimes it's not even tracked for new hires. It's not tracked for current individuals who work at a company. So representation matters. And tracking sexual orientation and gender identity, which we commonly will be referred to as SOGI data, is pretty essential to making that come to life. So say you want to advocate for an inclusive healthcare policy. Well, knowing how many people this will affect and how many people this will help and strengthen their lives is going to be very powerful in making the argument as to why it should happen. Or maybe you want to see a goal of how many gender diverse individuals you'd like to hire in the next quarter. Having that baseline is going to help you set that goal. So I would say knowing who is currently working in your company, figuring out why that isn't being tracked, understanding best practices, and that's when bringing in experts is very helpful. Understanding best practices of how you can track that will ultimately help you build goals, but more importantly, hold you accountable to whether or not you're meeting those metrics.
That is super powerful. And I mean, I think for those folks, and I was going back to who's on this call, for those folks leading broader DEI work, I think that challenge of a baseline for a variety of things, like I think probably a lot of people are nodding their head and are in agreement. And again, it's a baseline, right? It's just kind of measuring who's in your workforce and then thinking beyond that, thinking about developing talent, which includes trans and non-binary talent. How are you doing that? And we'll get into that, but I think what you offer here is super powerful and it's actionable, right? So it's kind of moving beyond, we're writing a policy, who is the policy for? Like kind of getting a better sense of that workforce. And I think that kind of leads to some additional questions that I have around this preparing for the future of work. And before I kind of like jump into the future of work, I have a question for you, Tati, which is around, we're talking about, in some of the research that I shared in the beginning of this conversation, just thinking about Zoomers, Gen Z, and kind of how gender by and large is more fluid, viewed as more fluid amongst younger people. And, our workplaces we're already in the workplace. So, many of us here, we've got a collective, a lot of experience working for employers in the past and now. So as we're thinking about preparing for the future of work, why is this like a both and from your perspective? What are some of the things that are important for employers to acknowledge now in the fact that we're already a part of the workforce?
The reality is that, and I don't know the current statistics right off the top of my head, but visibility of trans and gender non-binary and gender non-conforming and non-binary people are increasingly rapidly. And those employees who are currently working in the workplace, like I said, I don't know the exact number right off the top of my head, but those are, they're on the uptick for those who are feeling comfortable of transitioning within the workplace. And so for organizations and companies, like kind of what Nico was alluding to, having those things already prepared, those systems in place prior to these things occurring. If you don't have a gender transition policy that is in place, it will be translated into later as an add-on. Now you're having to go through all of your policies, all of your systems that you've invested in, your HRIS systems, built in all of that front end stuff, and not even taking the considerations about the back end, how these things will be deployed, how these, to trans people, even as something as small as the application on your website. When people are there to apply and they're putting in a lot of their volunteer data, there's no place for SOGI data. There's not even an option for me to identify outside of those two very binary kind of, choices. And there's a lot of spillage. And so from an HR perspective, it would be remiss for me to sit on here as an HR professional and not echo home that a lot of the work that you will do on, later on for an employee who decides one day, hey, I want to be recognized and affirmed in who I am, something as small as acknowledging pronouns within the HRIS. And so the preparation for that, and when we start to think about future work, start to prepare yourself to have these policies, even if you're in a place where you're like, we don't have any trans people. Maybe you have created an environment where people are not comfortable with identifying in the way that they want to openly. And even alluding to, like Nico said, earlier, there's a lot of organizations that don't even have their composition of their employees. Something as small as how many transgender employees do we have here, or how many people who identify as LGBTQ. And when you're, even for nonprofits, for funders, this information is very critical when you're starting to get down into like your diversity charts and, all of those things that would be incorporated into your grant applications. So I think for organizations and companies, doing those low preparatory steps, hiring consultants and people who are industry leaders in this field that have this expertise. And like Nico said, most times that falls on that one HR generalist. Hey, you'll be tasked with doing, leading the ERG and also the liaison for all trans employees. This person is already stretched to the hilt, and you're adding something else that is very, very, that has to be handled very, very carefully, because a lot of those things, because you'll find yourself from a client compliance and risk perspective with an EEOC complaint for something that you could have very much so avoided by having these systems and policies in place. And then also something that like kind of Nico and I, we talked about this when working with another organization. What good does it do to have these policies if they're not visible for everyone to see? And so that's another important step. Once you create these things, put them out there. Hey, because you create this environment for people who say, I have always been trans and I just didn't feel comfortable with letting people know that. And so once you do that, you create this environment of inclusion unknowingly and unseemingly, because you will find yourself where people will say, this is true. And people who may not be a part of that population or community will say, this is truly an organization that I love to work for because they are valuing people just in who they are.
Yes, yes. And so much of what you're saying, right? Like the visibility of policies, or even kind of like the physical space, if we are going back into the office when, for some people, but to just to take note of wow, it wasn't kind of like we're welcome. It's like the organization thought of us to kind of create all user restrooms, or making sure that people can share their pronouns in meetings if they want to, right? Like there's something that you said as well, kind of on this piece of safety, where it's just like kind of the research that we know is that there's 1.4 million adults who are transgender in this country, and that study was done a while ago, right? And I think that part of the research that we're seeing with younger generations is that, in that stat, 1 in every 4 Zoomers will consider transitioning their gender during their lifetime, right? Like it's this combination. It's not that there's more of us, or that more people are coming out as trans. I think it has to do with safety in the work that you all are doing in the workplace to build more gender inclusive workplaces. So I wanted to ask you, Autumn, as someone who is non-binary, right, to see these stats, to kind of know that the future of the workforce, that younger people feel more comfortable, safer, saying who they are despite all of this legislation. Can you share just kind of the significance of that for you as someone who's leading this work at Genentech? And what do you hope that business leaders will do with this information?
Yeah, I mean, let's see, I can see from my own personal experience coming to work at Genentech as a non-binary person, it didn't start that way. It was, I made that transition about halfway through my experience there. And I have to say I was welcomed with open arms. And navigating that process, however, was a struggle, because while Genentech did have various options and opportunities and benefits available to me to make that transition from a physical perspective as well from communications, it was on me to go hunt and find them, and it was quite the hunt. It took me a while to kind of unpack and talking to a lot of different people. And so when I became the co-director of G Pride like a few years ago, that was actually top of my mind and priority, because I had felt the pain of that experience of why isn't this easier? Why isn't this more consolidated? Why isn't this a better experience for people that actually have to use it? Because at the time, to me, it felt like they were just checking a box, that they just had this at the list. They were just checking a box, but they weren't really paying attention to the purpose of this whole thing, was to make this experience seamless and to make this a positive experience for somebody doing the transition. So that became the primary focus of what I tried to do. And I think that is, if anything, that is likely the key takeaway that I would want business leaders to come away with, is don't just check the box. Actually think about what the impact and the experience is of somebody going in and trying to access this information. And so what it looked like for me was I put together a sub-team of individuals, and we did an analysis of everything that existed across Genentech that related to gender transition, all the way from coming out to your team, how to navigate your health insurance, and then all the way after, like how you actually do the tactical aspects of changing your name and system access and what that looks like. Nowhere was that in a consolidated place. It was all contradicting itself. So we had a huge effort that we made with our DEI group, the G-Pride group at the time, and our HR group and IT to come together to consolidate and work together on putting one comprehensive package together that addressed the entire thing from beginning to end. And with that, then also came sort of this awareness like, oh, well, now that we have a gender transition guide, that's not the only thing that you can do. It's like, how do you actually create that culture of inclusivity widespread? How do you start having conversations with managers about how to share pronouns in meetings? How do you address those individuals that are resistant to that and just don't get it? You know, what are those tough conversations you need to have? And so that's then spawned a whole other aspect of developing training systems, basically, that allowed people to kind of get on board, essentially. And it's becoming, so we have a more systemized approach to how we're actually training and ingraining that culture in day to day. So it starts to become this seamless kind of experience. It doesn't seem like this heavy lift that, you know, they're just checking a box for something. It actually is just built into the culture when you get there. So people are offering pronouns, so that pronouns are seen on badges, that we have gender neutral restrooms and locker rooms available for everybody, you know. So it's these things that you just see that are just there that you don't have to go looking for. And to the aspect of SOGI data and self-ID, that is huge right now in our group. And it has been such a tangle to unravel because some of that data is very HR specific and it has to be private. And so there are ways that we've been working with, and we're also a global company. And so then there's a whole translation issue of what happens domestically versus globally that's been opened up and been a whole can of worms to untangle. But I think the key thing is don't just look at these little things as silos, like little one-off incidents. Look at the whole picture. And especially when it comes to data, it's not just like the HR system that you're plugging the data into. What is this HR system connecting to that uses that data? Like an example, like I still have issues trying to get my prescriptions filled because the prescription service that my provider uses does not have a system that acknowledges a non-binary gender. So it's unspecified and they reject my claims constantly. I have to keep calling. So these are just things that business leaders need to look at. They need to look at the entire picture, the whole experience, and not just isolated incidents of things.
Yeah, and thank you, Autumn, just for giving those examples of what that looks like. It's kind of the through line, right? So if you're centering the experiences of trans and non-binary employees, if your company's serving clients and customers, you know, you're a nonprofit doing human service related work, you have to kind of think about different experiences. And this is an experience, a part of if you truly want to build a gender inclusive organization and you've done that work, you've written the policies and you have non-discrimination language, you have to make it come to life. And I think that's the benefit of having ERG groups, having leaders like yourself, that you can keep your fingers on the pulse of experiences that you're having as well as other employees. And I'm wondering, Nico, for you, we're talking about trying to get business leaders to think about the future workforce. And I'm wondering what you find when sharing, when making the case, when sharing the why and how it will actually help an organization be that much more dynamic, innovative, creative, all the things we want, right? Like, what are some of the things that you share that actually move folks on the C-suite, different executives? I think that might be something that of the folks that are here with us today, they're thinking about, they get it themselves, they feel it. And yet, just trying to move other folks that could be champions, they just need to understand the why. What works for you?
Yeah, I think the focus of this conversation has been so much on gender diversity and the importance of that. And I can say that the business case for gender inclusion is very similar to the business case for why diverse companies are stronger and have stronger results. Excuse me. And that is shown. There's plenty of research out there as to why that is the case. So if your company is seeking to solve complex problems and innovate, cognitive diversity is going to put you ahead every time. Different ways of thinking offer different solutions and approaches, and you want to have as much of that on your team as possible. That is going to make you much more competitive, not only as an employer, but as you're seeking to innovate and solve for problems. So some folks argue that the hardest part is getting that gender diverse talent hired at your organization. There's a lot of conversations about, recruiting diverse talent, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue that the hardest part is actually keeping them there. And that speaks to what we have discussed so deeply in this conversation. What kind of environments are we creating so that folks from gender diverse backgrounds can thrive? They can feel heard and share their ideas so that your organization is actually benefiting from that cognitive diversity to help advance your mission. So if diverse individuals are spending their day advocating for inclusive policies, or maybe they're being misgendered, or maybe they're spending their day worrying about which bathroom they're going to feel comfortable using, that is a loss of ROI and that brain power that that individual is bringing, focusing on something other than the job that you have hired them to do. So you don't want these employees to have to be coming to work worrying about creating a community where they feel like they can thrive or where they feel like they can innovate. You want to be establishing a community of belonging where gender diverse individuals and anyone from any diverse background can come and work and perform their best. So I would say, it's twofold. If I had to sum it up, it's that cognitive diversity always thrives. Innovative teams are generally the most diverse teams. And two, you want to have the ROI of that individual by allowing them to go to work and innovate and not have to worry about things like figuring out their prescriptions or having to be on the phone with the claims or dealing again with insurance. That's not what you're hiring them to do. That hopefully is not something that they need to bring to work with them.
Yes. Well, I hope everyone was taking notes on that. Those are beautiful talking points, and it makes it easy to do this work when you're just able to reflect what we know through research and lived experience. And so I want to jump into a couple of participant questions. And for folks that are here, so happy that you've stayed engaged in this conversation. Please go ahead and plug your questions in. We're going to do our best to get through as many as we can. And for those that we aren't able to have time to respond to, we will in our thank you message with some resources. So the first question, I want to go to Janice's question. Janice was asking, wondering how much the human rights campaign, the HRC Corporate Equality Index, has driven LGBTQ plus equity work inside organizations. Janice's company definitely pays attention to our scores and the specific ways in which that index is measuring progress. And so kind of thinking about LGBTQ plus communities broadly, how has it, this is my question for you all, how has this potentially helped with trans and non-binary inclusion, and where are some of the barriers and kind of where that index can go? And it's open for whoever wants to jump in.
Start by saying, I think that index, the HRC index, has mobilized companies from a peer pressure perspective in ways that we would have never seen a couple of years ago. I also want to mention it's a great starting place, and it is by no means the end. I think it provides an organization that is just starting out and thinking about what it could look like to begin having these policies, to go through that index and see where they can begin to check the box. I think this discussion, this robust discussion, has provided more nuances into why just checking a box isn't enough. So I would argue it's a great starting place. It should by no means be the gold star for where we want to end. And I have to recognize that corporate index has provided a lot of momentum on what this work could look like for multiple organizations.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts on this? I mean, I think that was a really complete response. Okay. Yeah, there's a bunch. So just kind of, whoever goes first, we'll try to get through as many. So there's kind of two questions. One was anonymous and one was from Rachel about HR. And one was kind of a question about how do we move HR from being performative of like, sure, we support trans non-binary people, to actually doing some of the more nuanced actions that you all have shared. And then Rachel has a more specific question, which is an issue we run into is that some of our HR vendors don't create space for non-binary, trans, or gender fluid folks. And then X benefit enrollment forms and processes asked broadly for sex on a binary way. So wondering if anyone has experienced navigating this shortcoming with healthcare providers, including the option to change vendors. What are some possible responses? Autumn, you kind of brought this up, so not to put you on the spot, but do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, this was like one of the passion project that I brought in just because of my personal experience with it. And thankfully they've really moved the needle with that. But I think the power actually here lies with your employee resource groups. And this is where the power of employee resource groups can actually affect real change to policies and programs around the company. That in conjunction with HR, because they are the ones that actually move and push and pull the levers. And so recently we had our CDO office, our Chief Diversity Office, who's like really elevated the voices of our employee resource group. But I say the way in which that happens is for your employee resource group to work directly with HR counterparts in many cases and coming up with plans. It's like project management. In often cases, they don't have a lot of the resources to drive the projects themselves. So that does sometimes fall on the shoulders of the employee resource group. But as long as you're driving that with outcomes, holding them to task and being accountable to outcomes, you're also providing them the voice that they're oftentimes missing. And to Nico's point earlier, the CEI index is a great start, but that's not an excuse to outsource out other people's voices to be heard. Use the voices that you have on hand through your employee resource groups and let them help drive the outcomes that they want to see that could actually make real change. And then HR can actually do it. So, and if you've got if you're lucky enough to have a DEI office or a CDO office, they can be the ones that build that into like long-term strategies and goals with your executive leaders. So I'd say just make sure that you're partnering with the right groups, and HR is definitely where you want to start from benefits perspective.
Awesome. Thank you. Tati, I know that you're deep in HR everything. So anything else to add on that one?
Yeah, and one of the, because I do want to understand this because I was reading, because I've read it several times, and I want to make sure that I'm so the vendors that are like benefits and benefits packaging for HR specifically for the organization, and that's where I'm answering from. I hope, Rachel, that that's where you're asking. Yes. So interesting enough, one of the things, HR is in a very, very unique position when it comes to these things because they can advocate for these things to be changed. I work with a LGBTQ organization here in the Midwest most recently, and I actually encountered this myself when going through gender confirmation surgery and being denied for short-term disability because of an exclusion that we had not completely went through, and just working through and having my vice president at the time advocating for change. And HR is uniquely situated because when you get down to the basics of it, in a lot of these HRS vendors will tell you, well, we don't have those in the systems. It does not have to be front facing where it's outward appearing. A lot of these things can be on the back end, and it's just as simple as adding a code within that algorithm that changes those things. When it comes to forms, but HR has the responsibility to not just stop at no, because we're contracting with you all, we're giving you money. They have a motivation. And even in my situation, when talking to my vice president, talking to them, like, do you realize how much money we're spending with you all? And if we were to decide to take that somewhere else. And so a lot of those things, like I said, HR has that kind of unique responsibility and power to kind of advocate for these things, and not just stopping at no, because the vendors who are not willing to make those changes, there are vendors who will. And looking at some of those smaller boutique vendors who may, do offer those same services, but they are going to be inclusive to your employees, because that's the intent here, ensuring that they have everything that they need so that they can show up to continue to be their best selves every day.
Yes, the power is with the buyer, and so don't discount the power that you have in that collaboration, with your ERG members, with IT, HR. If you have a DEI office or a chief diversity officer, and expert consultation to kind of build that capacity as you move forward. Really good responses. I think there's time for one more. These questions are amazing. So we will provide you with resources. So no stress there. But there is this question, and it's both kind of a question on allyship and resistance. So there was a question, and this was it was from Catherine of wanting to really help advance more broadly kind of LGBT inclusion, we'll kind of keep it narrowly focused around gender inclusion, and kind of struggling with like, what is my role? Because I don't want to speak for other people. It's not my experience. And at least that's how I'm kind of reading that question. And then there's this other question about folks who are resistant to using the names and pronouns that we use, right? So basic respect there. So, I'm wondering if someone wants to field that question, thinking about the role of allyship and this, the resistance that sometimes pops up for some folks that just, they're on a learning journey and they're still at that acorn stage. They have not advanced to the oak tree. So who would like to jump in first? Okay, Autumn, please.
So yeah, what we found, because a lot of this conversation came up just really early on at Genentech, and what we found is that there needs to be a lot of education around upper level executives, because oftentimes people will follow the pace of executive leaders, whether they're fully, bought into it or not, they are the ones that set the pace. And so we've made it really, really important to make sure and mandate that our executive leaders are doing the training they need to in order to be able to have awareness around pronouns and how they actually, lead by example around pronoun usage and honoring people's different diverse gender expressions. And it kind of trickles down from there. And managers can then be held accountable by their upper executive leaders, and then managers can watch out for the same behavior of all of their employees. But I think education is key, and you always start at the upper levels. And from my experience, it's always been like, yes, what can we do? We want to know more. We want to do the right thing. They do a lot in terms of self-educating, but they really want in many ways to be guided in terms of what actually resonates with you all, in terms of what's going to make the most powerful impact.
I love it. It's setting the tone, and I think it's a good place to end on. For now, this is just the beginning of many conversations that I hope, for folks that are still here with us, that I hope you carry forward in your organizations. Want to share a few resources, and also be respectful that we've got about a minute left. So if people have to jump, please jump. But I don't want to leave you hanging. So the resources that we've got available are a few things. So the first is, and I will share this here, is a gift that we've offered in the chat. Some folks might not be able to access Google Documents, so this will go out in a thank you note so long as you've registered for this webinar or panel discussion. So there's a couple of things on the checklist that are organizational actions that maybe your organization has taken or could. And most importantly, there's personal actions that you can begin taking or you can continue taking. So that checklist is available for you, and there's tons of resources that are embedded into it. So definitely check that out. And the last thing that I just want to share is, if you do have questions and in our thank you note we don't answer them, and you're like, wait, I need this answered, there's a general email, hello@rhodesperry.com. Go ahead and send all your questions there, and we'll do our best to kind of compile the resources that will be of service for you all. We've got a summit coming up next month called the Belonging Network Summit. And we've got a number of trans and non-binary people speaking at that summit, along with a lot of other amazing DEI thought leaders. So if you're hungry for conversations like these, if you want more, that is a 5-day summit. It's totally free for the live summit. The registrations link is on this slide here, and we will also share that in our thank you note. So with that, I just want to, and for Tati, Nico, Autumn, thank you for staying a little bit longer. I want to give you all the opportunity, if there's one final thought that you want those who are still here with us to kind of leave with, the virtual mic is yours.
Guess I'll go first. Make the realization that the issues and things that we as trans and non-binary individuals face don't exist only in the month of June. It's a 365-day complex journey and 66 days in the leap year. But as people who are looking to be our allies, show up for us even when we are not present. Speak up for us when we're not there. That is what we want. That's true allyship. When you have the ability and the power to speak up for those people who are not necessarily in the room, but you still choose to do that very thing. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And I just wanted to say too, it's not about getting it right. And I think often people get tripped up with that. It's not about getting it right. It's about doing what you can with what you know, and then learning as you go, and just having the humility and the bravery to mess up and to keep going. So as Brene Brown said, it's have a strong back and a soft heart and lead with empathy.
I love that.
I have
Nico.
absolutely nothing to add to those two brilliant messages. The last thing I will just say is thank you for your dedication to this work. By you being here, you're either taking a step in the right direction, or maybe this is your first step. And also just thank you to Rhodes for creating the space for learning, because that's how we get to do better.
Yes, I love it. And thank you all for sharing so generously. I've learned a lot, and it's always a pleasure connecting and collaborating with you all. So for everyone who has been and invested this hour in your own learning, thank you, and keep going. This is truly just the beginning. We've got tons of resources for you, and I just want to say, thank you for growing this belonging movement by centering those who are least likely to feel safe. And today we got a little glimpse of how to make some change. So I hope you feel motivated and inspired. And if you feel stuck, or if you still aren't sure where to start, 4 people here can help you. So we're on your side, so keep going. And until the next time, hopefully I'll see many of you next month in July. Have a really great day. And thank you. Thank you again for being here. Awesome. Yeah. And as folks are leaving, I just, again, want to thank you all for being here. So I don't like endings, so I'm just going to kind of stay here and see if there's any other questions.
Me and your Nico like, okay, no, I don't want my people to go.
I know you all are
This is
busy.
amazing. Thank you, Rhodes. Thank you, Rhodes, for this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank
Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much. Yeah.
Take care.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. I think they said they wanted you to show that last slide again too, Rhodes.
Oh yeah. If anyone's still here, thank you. Yeah, so I will do that.
See you all. Thank you, Nicole.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
That was awesome. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Oh yeah, this is really great. This is really great. So that looks like there's 26 people still here. So so thank you for sticking around. I'm just kind of looking at the questions to make sure that we have all that. There was a question that someone had about transcripts, so I will get creative about how to share that. I think probably just as a Google document, so that you have some of those great talking points that were offered by all of the panelists. And Nicole, I don't think we lose that, right? If we close the session out, and I don't think so.
I don't think we lose the transcripts. I'm not sure about the Q&A, but I assume it's going to still be open. I mean, we'd have access to those.
Yeah.
Not entirely sure though, because
Yes,
for
Jean has our back. Jean says you can save transcript and share as a text. So we'll probably, I'll just kind of copy and paste it and put it maybe in the worksheet, as just kind of an addition to that. So it's yeah, librarians, awesome, very cool. All right, well, I feel very supported. So so thank you for that tech support. All right, I'm gonna run the risk of ending this meeting, and hopefully we'll have all of that saved in the Google file or the Zoom files. And Nicole, thank you so much. This is great.
Yeah, thank you.
Debrief later. All right, have a great day, everybody. Bye.